Welcome to another edition of EverybodyHatesCleveland.com, the podcast. I am your sultry host, Jim Pete, joined as always by one Mike Hattery. Michael, that was dedicated to you, my friend. You were you're the smoothest opener on the history of podcasting opens, and I just wanted to try to throw that out. I feel like we're doing some sort of like late night podcast when you host, and that's unique.
I have nothing to respond to that with.
You didn't see that?
Absolutely. I have nothing.
I love when I leave you speechless. See, now you're the guy not only staring back at me, but not saying anything back to me. No, So as we get more voices podcasting for EHC, I think it's different from me, which is a good thing right away. But it's a style all your own. Like it's not a podcasting style we see from everybody else, and it fits you. It fits your style, man. It's it's you. It's the Hattery podcast. I look forward to it every time. Now you cannot now come out with some bombastic start. You've got to stay the same.
Yeah, I am a boringly monotone person. I ultimately feel bad for the sorts of people who have to listen to my sultry tone.
No, dude. No, I'm sure people appreciate the subtle calmness that you bring to the podcast. I love it. I'm telling you, it's the sound of the future.
Yes, may we all be droids.
I love it. Well, we do have a fairly, I guess one way to look at today's podcast is a fairly boring podcast in that we have an incredible lineup to look at. We're talking, of course, about the Indians' rotation, especially the top three. And when I say boring, it's the one, I guess the top end of this is the one part of this team that's really, when you're talking 1, 2, and 3, you can interchange any of these guys. Of course, we're talking about Corey Kluber, Danny Salazar, and Carlos Carrasco. And we've peppered out many of our podcasts prior to this with those three. The excitement of the rotation this year is going to be really, aside from their performance. So when I say boring, I'm not talking about how they perform. I'm talking about the quote unquote position battle. I think the most intriguing part of the rotation is 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, depending on how deep we want to go with this. And the battles that will commence really on, as March comes to a close and we head into April, watching how the bottom end of this rotation develops. And as I shift over to Mike, I guess my first question, let's kind of get this part over with. The Indians named Corey Kluber as their number one starter today. In essence, he's starting opening day. But in reality, Mike, we've got three. We've got a 1A, a 1B, and a 1C. And I guess probably the one guy we could probably place is the 1C. And I think the Indians and the fans look at Danny Salazar as the 1C. But in reality, this is a rotation where we see from year to year, especially the past two, guys kind of passing the baton. When we have injury, especially, it seems as though one of these guys always steps up. And it really started it started 3 years ago with Kluber kind of walking in with a big month. Then Salazar kind of splashed into the equation. And then Carrasco kind of splashed into the equation. And now all three of them are kind of peaking at the same time. Really, it isn't a determination on who's the ace, Mike. It's just a determination on who's healthy and who has the hot hand. Do you see these three guys entering their prime or holding their prime this year throughout the season? Health, of course, being a factor. Is this the best top three in baseball, or at least the best top three in the American League, or the best top three that we've ever seen, or just all the above?
Definitely the best top three in the American League, though. I think Chicago's rotation is actually very, very good and almost as good. I think the Mets is probably the top threes are very comparable. I might like the Indians as much. I think if you're, I don't think there's any substantive way to actually differentiate between them. And Jim, we love Danny, right? And here's the thing. He's not even in his prime yet. He's like a 25-year-old who last year figured out that his splitter was one of the 10 best pitches in baseball. And the Indians figured it out too and finally trusted it. So we're there with Danny. We're one explosion away from having three guys who could anchor almost any rotation in baseball that didn't have the name Kershaw in it.
Well,
and that's where we are.
The interesting connection there, Mike, is you're looking at a guy like Danny Salazar, and you mentioned we're talking about a guy who's 25 years old, who is actually 26. Even so, we're talking about a guy who, think about Kluber and Carrasco, where they were at the same age. You had Carrasco struggling with injury and with keeping his head on straight and with consistency at the big league level. And you had Kluber, who wasn't even a factor at the big league level. And you've got Salazar starting to figure out that quote unquote third pitch that everybody is also worried about. He's further along. If you look at the three guys, he's at the same age. He's way further along than these other guys were, right? So we are waiting for him to hit his prime. Even when you look back at last year, which was a great year for Salazar, he hasn't even touched his ceiling yet.
Yeah, I think when you look at somebody who posted 3 WAR season at age 25, and you can say, "Hey, we haven't seen peak Salazar yet." And he's your third best starter. Who the hell gets to do that? I don't know.
Well, and that's the interesting piece to this, because if they pitch well and he's not our third best starter, that's a great thing, because one of two things has happened. He's either surpassed the guys ahead of him, or somebody has surpassed him, which we'll get to in a second. And I'm not saying that can't happen. It's not likely to happen, but that's when things get interesting. And that's when, as I think Salazar is kind of a cog in this rotation for a lot of reasons. I think if he's not our third starter in a variety of different ways, I think our rotation can be pretty special.
Absolutely. As long as the reason isn't an injury. The guy basically has become an above league average starter without really throwing a third pitch. And it's something I talked about last year before and during spring training, when everyone was overreacting because, well, it's spring training and people are really dumb, even though we tell them not to overreact. They can't help it. But Salazar has 2 elite pitches. He's 26 years old, and he's playing with a third. And if you want to bet on guys who can add a third good pitch, it's guys with great arm speed and 2+ pitches already. He's going to be even better this year. He improved his ground ball rate markedly last year, which is really awesome for how it fits with this team's defense, and something that nobody really highlights. He got better in so many ways, and he's only 26 years old, and he has an elite arsenal. I think he makes a leap to a Cy Young contender this year, joining the front end.
Well, it's you and I both know it's about rhetoric. A lot of people like to just say, "Oh, he's going to be a closer," or he can't. He gives up too many home runs. And the minute he does, of course, in a spring training game, he gives up some jacks, and of course, that's the end of the world. Put him in the pen, blah blah blah. I think the rhetoric is always for Danny Salazar going to be, he gives up too many fly balls, he gives up too many home runs, he only has 2 pitches, and I think that's the problem. I think with fans these days, because there are a couple of loudmouths who come off as the end all and be all, when in reality, if you look at Danny Salazar throughout his career, the way the Indians front office has handled him, first they handled him with kid gloves, bringing him up through the system carefully because they understood he had an elite arm. They bring him up in the midst of a pennant run the same year that Ubaldo Jimenez's last year, the same year that they made that 10-game run. They bring him up in the midst of a pennant run against the Tigers, and in that famous game where he struck out Cabrera 3 times before giving up the home run. They've handled him like an ace. He's always been a guy that they thought has a high baseball IQ, and I know we talk about that a lot, to the point where whenever I say it, I'm sure people are rolling their eyes. But if you stop and you look at these guys on this team, he has shown that same IQ that we talk about with Michael Brantley, that we talked about with Jason Kipnis, that we talk about with Francisco Lindor, that we talk about defensively with Gio Urshela, and we talk about with some of these guys that they've brought in, like a Uribe, high baseball IQ guys. Don't you see his development? If you look at him year by year by year, starting way back in 2011 in the minor leagues, he's shown that same baseball IQ with regards to getting his arm ready, then getting into the bigs, and now kind of developing an arsenal that makes him elite.
Yeah, I do. And I think one of the things that, I talked to a couple of people who are in the Indians clubhouse pretty consistently. And one of the really clear things is that Salazar has a sort of budding relationship with Bauer. And I think Bauer can get in the way of himself sometimes. But one of the things that they're constantly talking about is sort of Bauer's pitching philosophies and the things that he does to prepare. And to me, that really just shows how Salazar is an inquisitive guy who's constantly trying to find different ways to improve. And to me, that's really positive. And I think it's something we've seen through this whole system. The other thing that I think you pointed to that is something that I don't think we talk about enough. I think we see guys like Kluber and Gomes and Salazar who snuck up on a lot of people. And when people sneak up, when we see players who make the leap to really elite and people didn't see coming, they want to criticize them and undermine them. They want to find weaknesses or things that, reasons they were wrong about them. And that's understandable. But I think sometimes the Indians have been really good at developing guys who they saw had really good tools but had imperfections. And it was a process. And they came along a little later in the development cycle. And Salazar's not that way. He's young. But I think there's this sneaking up on people who cover the team that makes them uncomfortable. And these guys are just really good.
Yeah. And I kind of knew we were going to head down the Salazar path with this. And, and like I said, I think, he is our number 3 guy. If everything holds true and Kluber and Carrasco pitch the way we think they will, if Salazar kind of forces his way above them, or if somebody else forces their way above Salazar, I think this rotation will have a very interesting look throughout the year. Let's shift our attention to Corey Kluber. The interesting in a podcast I did with Tribe Time Now, and really in a lot of podcasts that we did over the past year, we talk about Kluber last year, and I want when I say the term struggle, I want to counterbalance that with, we're talking about a 4-WAR pitcher last year who did a lot of things really, really good, had a lot of bad breaks early in the season, lost control. And when I say lost control, I'm not talking about, throwing behind the backstop or anything like that. Seemed to struggle as the year progressed, and maybe battling injury, maybe battling, thoughts in his head. Had some bad games. But comparatively speaking, again, we're talking about a 4-WAR player who really pitched well for most of the year last year in Corey Kluber. People are starting to understand that a 9-16 record doesn't equate to good or bad. He did finish in the top 10 in the Cy Young Award voting last year, so voters are starting to understand who Corey Kluber is. You're looking at a guy who, has elite stuff, had 245 strikeouts last year, did a lot of things almost as good as he did in this Cy Young, his Cy Young season of 2014. Lots of things to be excited about with Kluber, right? I mean, he's a little older. Really, there wasn't a drop-off in much last year. It looks like he had some minor tinkering that he needed to do, and by all indications, he's going to do that this year. Is this another elite season from Cy Kluber, or was that slight drop in performance last year? And when I say slight, I'm talking slight, an indicator that he's regressing to the pitcher that he's going to be?
So I think Kluber's poison is that his 2014 was really special. He had probably one of the 5 best pitching performances of the last 7 years in terms of output. And I think one of the tough things is that usually you just don't repeat those seasons. I mean, I think we saw the best season we're ever going to see from Corey Kluber, which isn't to say he isn't going to be a Cy Young contender again, because he still is. And it isn't to say that he isn't going to be elite. I think it's just that season was truly special and might have been his peak season. He's going to be really good. He was really solid in 2015. We saw his kind of statistics balloon a little bit at the end of the year because, he was battling with some injuries, and he just looked a little gassed ultimately. And I think Kluber, kind of played through things he shouldn't have because they were still trying to contend. He's going to be, the same elite guy he was last year, maybe a little better, a little worse, but that guy's here to stay. I just don't think we see 2014 again. And I don't think that's I think that's reasonable. I think we might see 2015 again, and that's an elite season. I mean, depending on WAR, if you do F WAR, it's 5.5. If you do R WAR, it's 4. But either way, it's front end, and he'll be special this year again.
Yeah, and I think you want to talk about a guy who had everything go well for him. I mean, that 2014 season, you couldn't help but watch that year and think, that end of July performance against Felix Hernandez, to me, kind of said it all. I mean, he outperformed probably the guy that most people in the league at the time thought was the best starter in baseball, and he outdueled him, which really opened the eyes of a lot of people, which, I mean, essentially that start got him the Cy Young. I'm not saying that the other ones didn't as well, but that was kind of the one that smacked people in the face, which maybe explains why he was 9th in Cy Young voting last year in front of a guy like Carrasco, who maybe was, I don't want to say consistently better, but had perhaps the best starts for the Indians last year in a couple of performances that he had. But I think, would you not agree, Kluber is an elite performer who, if the ball bounces right, is the best pitcher in baseball. If the ball doesn't bounce right, is one of the best pitchers in baseball.
Yeah, absolutely. So,
well, in Mike, the ball could bounce right for him a lot this year. I mean, they put a pretty good defense behind him, at least in the infield.
Yeah, so for Kluber, Carrasco, for anybody, the ball's going to bounce right, and I love ranting about team defense. I've done it for so long that it's like I've become boring and out of style, unfortunately. I'd like to say I did it before it was cool, and I think I did, but I really don't care at this point. But Napoli, Uribe, Lindor, Kipnis, that is such a solid infield. Who, Lord knows what the outfield's going to look like at this point. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, Carrasco is particularly well suited to this infield. He has the highest ground ball rate. He gets tons of Ks, a lot of ground balls, decent amount of pop-ups. He's just a dominant force of nature.
Yeah. And it's going to be fun to kind of see where he is this year in comparison to other years. I think he fashions himself as a leader of this rotation in a lot of ways is. And, he's the kind of guy, I think, Mike, when you talk about intangibles, I think he has a lot of those intangibles that could come into play in stressful games, which is why he's likely starting the season off and likely gets the ball in playoff situations if those happen. And so it should be fun watching his third full season as a Tribe starter this year and what elite means this year for him. I would love to see another one of those 2014 seasons to put him kind of in that pantheon of some of the other starters that people know and love in Major League Baseball. The other guy, of course, is Carlos Carrasco, and I think he is, and I'm not going to lie, I'm kind of in on this bandwagon. He is the trendy pick, I think, to have kind of a breakout ace-like year. Not that he didn't have one last year. There's so much upside to Carlos Carrasco. A lot of the stuff that we saw in Kluber in 2014, we really saw in Carrasco over the past full season, his first real full season as a starter, and he did not disappoint. This is a guy who's content in Cleveland, a guy with 4+ pitches, a guy that loves everything about pitching for Cleveland, a guy who really has, after a lot of people gave up on him, went down to the minors as a bullpen guy, came up as a bullpen guy, got the ball again, and hasn't looked back. Again, I hate to pound this into the wall, but that shows kind of that baseball IQ we keep talking about. Something clicked where the mind met the talent. Do you see him as a guy who possibly could this year, kind of in that perfect storm of ability and age, Could you see Carrasco reach a level that he hasn't reached before? Could you see he seems to have, he's got the velocity, he's got control, he's got all the pitches you could possibly want. He can throw it by you, he can throw it around you. It's tantalizing, Mike, to look at a guy like Carrasco and say there's more there. And it's also easy to kind of fall into the trap of seeing an elite-ish season like we did last year and think there's more there. And again, like kind of that conversation like we had with Kluber, he's just steadies off. And that could mean a slight drop. That could mean he just stays where he's at. Do you see upside there, Mike, or have we seen the best that Carrasco's got, which is pretty darn good?
I see upside. He's been in the rotation a short enough time. I certainly see upside. The great ground ball rate, great K rates. I think, to me, Carrasco, if I was a betting man, I'd say, to me, he's much more likely to win a Cy Young Award this year than Kluber. And I mean, I guess that doesn't matter attributing that thing. But to me, I think in terms of someone like leaping back to that 7-WAR season, now this isn't like a certainty, but I think there's like a 20 to 30% chance he posts one of those special 7-WAR seasons and makes that leap forward, and certainly improves a little bit at the margins either way. So yeah, to me, Carrasco is the one that I think is going to have the best year this season.
Are you worried about health at all with any of these three?
Yeah, well, anybody who like throws a baseball for the living, I get super scared about. Outside that, not really. Kluber has proven to me that he's handled a pretty good workload, which is nice. But he's getting, he's the oldest of the three. Carrasco and Salazar have obviously had arm surgeries in the past. So I'm not worried about them more than anyone else in baseball, any other starting pitcher in baseball. But I'm always worried, especially with this team, in terms of how reliant they are on how productive the starting pitching is.
Well, and to be fair, a guy like Carrasco has not pitched over 200 innings since the injury or ever. And Salazar, they have taken care of. And their mechanics, the one thing you don't hear a lot about with these three are mechanics. They seem to have Salazar, is a guy, I think early in his career, people were worried about his mechanics. But over those years, again, we talk about and kind of where I'm going with these big three before we start looking at the bottom end of the rotation. And this kind of leads to it, is these three take really well to coaching. Of course, the ballyhooed story of Corey Kluber struggling at AAA and, having a meeting with Callaway and Niebla in the middle of that season and immediately transformed his career. Carrasco, obviously, we've talked about, his rise 2 years ago at the end of the year. And Salazar, who, again, we talked about, has this continual sort of development into this ace as he slowly starts to more than just overpower people. They really take the coaching well, Mike, and it looks like their mechanics are about as sound as a top three can be. Now, that doesn't guarantee arm injury health or arm health, but it does kind of lend to the possibility that we've got three guys who are built for the long haul, right? I mean, taking the coaching, having good mechanics, that could mean good things. I mean, as good as you can get when you're throwing the ball 95 plus, and you're throwing the type of balls that move that these guys do. But best case scenario is that they have good mechanics.
Yeah, I agree. I think the Indians have a phenomenal training staff that they seem to invest really well in, and that other guys who are looking to rebound their careers who have had arm health come to because it's so trusted. A and B, their mechanics seem really sound. I'm not great with mechanics, but everybody I trust, including you, says, and to me visually they look really stable mechanically. So I think, that's positive. There's always risk, but having those two things in their favor makes you a little more comfortable.
Yeah, they have tight, compact deliveries, which is always best when you're talking about starting pitchers. And, when you're throwing the ball with the velocity that these guys do, that's a worry, always a worry. But I guess, in the land of starting pitching where it's always a worry health-wise, it's certainly a good thing that these guys are solid mechanics-wise. And I think the other good thing is when they struggle with mechanics, the Indians have had no problems coming up with a reason for them not to start to get those mechanics back in play. the real fun of this rotation in the spring isn't the big three. I mean, it's always fun to watch them pitch, but we know they're standing. The real fun with this rotation is who ends up the 4 and 5. And I think one thing that I've been pretty clear on over the past 4 or 5 years is that the Indians don't look at spring training as the end all and be all of the race for the 4 and 5. They're historically a team that has gone as deep as August, still kind of moving guys around before finding the right guys. And I think that's an important part of this quote unquote battle that I want to talk about, Mike. While most people are focusing hard on April, the Indians really aren't doing that. The Indians are looking for the two guys to fill in this rotation come August and September when the games, and I know I can get into the fight with all the people on Twitter, and you guys know who I'm talking about. Every game is as important as the other. And I'm not saying that's not true. Of course, a win is a win and a loss is a loss. But we all know August and September does bring a slight bit more stress, especially when you're competing for a playoff spot, if you're competing for a playoff spot. I think the Indians are looking for that to kind of settle out by August. And first of all, Mike, would you not agree that this kind of seems to be the Indians' mentality? I don't know if it's Francona or the front office or kind of a blended, I would guess a blended kind of strategy. Find the guys that can lead you into the playoffs.
Yeah, I also think this year it's not going to, the pitching depth we're talking about, them figuring out, parsing between it is so much better than it was last season. I think last season it was kind of fair that Iyer could be drawn, that we were running, Zach McAllister out there, who we know who Zach McAllister is. But I agree. I think that this team is worried about, and not even just, late season, this team's worried about who's going to be pitching games after June 5th. And they're certainly worried about early games and they want to get off to a good start. But I think that, they don't go into spring training trying to make decisions about their starting rotation based on like a month of pitchers trying to get comfortable with their stuff. They know that for them to have the best rotation, they have to use a much bigger sample of information that includes what's happening in AAA, what's happening at the big league level, and what happened before. So, yeah, I totally agree.
Oh, and I mean, you can stop here with regards to proof. Corey Kluber got his first job as a starter with the Indians. Scott Kazmir was out. Danny Salazar, August was his first start of 2013. And Carrasco, again, I mean, got the chance, lost the chance, got the chance, lost the chance, got the chance, lost the chance, and eventually made his way up as a starter at the end of August. So you're looking at three guys at the top end of the rotation who are now fairly elite, who started off the season as powerful starters, as big-time starters late in the season with that same mentality taken into account. All right. I'm just going to go out here and I'm just going to say this. For Trevor Bauer and Josh Tomlin not to be the 4 or 5 starters, and this is just my opinion, but I'll try to vet this out a little bit as we go. I kind of think Bauer and Tomlin are the guys. I think that they have to fall off a cliff not to get to be the starters. And I know a lot of people were pointing to Tomlin's start today, gave up 2 runs in 2 innings, is not being able to slam the door on the competition. Again, I don't think the Indians are looking at April as being the competition deadline, but that neither here nor there. They signed Tomlin to a 2-year deal. They, Trevor Bauer is a starter in their eyes, and they still look at him in many of the same ways we looked at the other 3 that we talked about. That's my take, Mike, and I'm not going to ask you if you agree. I know that we're going to get into a conversation here in a second about Cody Anderson, TJ House, Mike Clevenger, and some other guys that may be interesting as the year progresses. But who are your 2 guys? Like if you were to say are going to be 4 or 5 right now, who are your guys?
Yeah, I think you said it. I think Bauer, Tomlin are the clear 4 or 5 exiting spring training. I'll tell you, I really don't think that's how it's going to finish. But I think, exiting spring training, it's going to be Bauer and Tomlin. I really want like a megaphone. Is there a way I can get a Twitter megaphone so I can tell people to shut the hell up about spring training results? Is that possible? I'm so sick of this. It is like so like I don't want to hear about Ursula going like 2 for 3 and he's not letting the job go quietly. And I don't really care if Anthony Recker hits a home run in spring training. He doesn't matter at all. Okay. And I love Naquin, but I don't really care if he's like 4 for 8 in the first 3 games. It doesn't matter. None of it matters. I'm so whatever. But yes, I think it's going to be Tomlin and Bauer.
Well, you would have to. I mean, there's so many ways. There's so many places I could go with that. You've served up a volley to me, and I'm just going to let it fall. I'm not even going to go after it. Yeah, I think the more years that you pay attention to spring training, the more you realize that there are just guys who have the job. And there are other guys who aren't really trying to earn the spot in April, whether they play well or not. Again, you just have to watch how the front office starts things off, and you kind of follow it up with how the management handles things and on the field management, like Francona. And I think when you sign Tomlin to a 2-year deal, you are not signing him to do other things other than start. You're saying you're our guy. Now, I could see him in the pen. I mean, I think there's some wiggle room here, and I could see him in the pen, but I don't know. And again, you got to take options into account here as well. Tomlin's going to be on this big league club, period, end of story. They signed him to a 2-year deal. So he's either in the rotation or he's in the bullpen. And I find it, we've already talked about the pen, and we did mention Tomlin there, but I just don't see it. He's going to have to pitch really badly or get hurt, in my opinion, not to be a 4-5. The more interesting guy to me is Trevor Bauer. And by that, I mean what they ultimately do with him, whether he's in the rotation or I believe in the bullpen. And I think he's going to be given the ball in April as a starter regardless. Of all of the guys we're going to talk about, he's the most intriguing for the same reasons he's been interesting in years past. There's so much there, and we've talked about this prior in prior podcasts. There's so much there. We talked about this when we talked about him in the pen. All right, so here we go with this. Let's talk Bauer. He's an eclectic guy, and I'm almost sick of talking about how eclectic he is. He's got the stuff. He's got the arm. He's got the IQ as far as off-the-field IQ goes. Here's where I differentiate on-the-field acumen, taking the coaching, understanding your role, to just being plain smart. I worry, Mike, that he's just plain smart and not really a baseball guy. And I'm not saying this necessarily in a bad way. But do you get what I'm saying here? Like, I worry that his mechanics and his development is more of almost an engineering thing as opposed to I'm going to win games thing.
Yeah, I think if Trevor Bauer wasn't some sort of like pitch scientist, we'd really view him very, very differently. I think we'd look at him as a guy who is. If we didn't see that he was an eccentric engineer with a brilliant mind, we'd see a guy who used too many pitches in his arsenal. We'd see a guy who failed to refine 3 or 4 pitches that could make him an above average league starter instead of tinkering with 7 at a time. I think we'd see a guy who failed to sort of adapt to do the things that he needed to do, become dominant rather than average. So I think some of the mystique of Bauer is frustrating. Because it blocks us from a more realistic view of Bauer. I'm optimistic about him just because his stuff is great. The other great thing about Bauer, one of the awesome things is his arm health. He's done a lot of things to strengthen his arm, and I think that's one of the cool side things he does. But at times you just need a guy who can go and give you like 180 decent innings, and Trevor Bauer can give you 180 decent innings. The thing is, the Indians are so deep that they might have 1 or 2 guys that can give the Indians 180 good innings. And we'll see if Bauer can do that, but there's some other guys who might be able to do that too.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess, we could talk for hours about this guy, and it's, you wonder, the funny thing is me, you, and Adam Burke talked extensively at the end of last year about, whether or not he would keep pitching. There were rumors that maybe he was going to retire. And the sad thing is I think us saying that, while sounds kind of kooky, I think when you look at the complete package that is Trevor Bauer, you could see maybe a frustration level that maybe the coaches don't get what I am trying to do here. And I guess at the end of the day, I wonder and worry if ultimately, that doesn't come to fruition as he slowly starts to develop. I mean, the barrel end of this guy is when he's on, there is again the same sort of potential we talk about with Salazar. We're talking about a guy, at 25, who really could dominate. Is kind of got that same sort of stuff. And I hate to compare him to Cy Young winners in the past, but when you think of when you think of pitchers with a type of stuff that he has, I mean, you think of those Braves pitchers, guys who can locate, who can outthink hitters, who can work the zone. And when he utilizes, an arsenal that befits a starting pitcher and not an arsenal that befits Ubaldo Jimenez when he was trying to throw 27 pitches, he seems to be a guy that can control the zone. And there are games where he has these 3 or 4 innings where he is almost unhittable. Can he be that guy, Mike? Can he be that guy over a 9-inning span or a game-long span?
I really don't know. The weird thing about Bauer is last spring, and we don't value spring, but last spring at the start he said, I'm going to just, worry about controlling my fastball and getting ahead. And we saw a spring where he walked one guy in 40 innings. I just think this is him doing this is not that far away. I think there are choices he needs to make in order to reach this point, but I don't think it has anything to do with his talent. And it is beyond irritating that he won't adapt.
Well, we shall see. And I think for sake of time, as we've promised to keep these podcasts because I suspect, Mike, as we get into the tail end of this rotation and we talk about Tomlin, his potential this year, and then we dive into a guy like TJ House, who both of us have grown an affinity for, and maybe the most intriguing guy of the bunch, Mike Clevenger, who perhaps we can get into as well. I think that's when this conversation is going to get really interesting. And when we talk about what this rotation looks like in August and September, as we sort of domino through some of these guys, I think who you think will be in the rotation and who I think it will be in the rotation is going to be interesting, because if you look at the history of the Indians, especially over the past 4 or 5 years, what they've done with certain guys in the organization has been telling. And, when you talk about how they handle starters moving up from single to double to triple A, the conversation this year could get very interesting, because there is a guy sitting in this who I believe is going to start off in triple A, who fits the mold of a quote unquote Indians trade candidate. And I don't mean trading him away. I think the Indians a lot of times look internally for deals to bring up a guy and be the one who kind of bolsters a rotation or bolsters the infield or bolsters the outfield. And I do think we have a guy who fits that bill. But we'll use that as a segue into the starting rotation part 2, which we will get into, and you can tune into here at EHC the day after this podcast post, which this podcast should post sometime Monday morning. So look on Tuesday or Wednesday for part 2. You can find out what we think about the 4-5 spot officially as we move towards August. Michael, anything you'd like to plug before we roll out of here?
Don't look at spring training box scores.
Well, there you go. And on that note, again, if you haven't heard before, check us out on iTunes, subscribe, give us some votes, vote 4 or 5. We will love you. We will say hi to you. And Joe Dirte, we saw it. We know who you are.
We love you, Clay.
You're the man. Thank you so much. We will read your stuff on air. And Clay, I don't have it in front of me, but you'll be in the pitching part 2. And we'll give you big props. Thanks for joining us, and we will see you in the near future. Go Tribe. Oh, and hey, the Indians haven't won a game in spring, which means, a whole lot in the land of spring training. It's just a factory of sadness. I'm sad. Goodbye.